I went to surprise my wife at work, and found a sign for my own divorce. I ended everything the same day. I walked into my wife's office holding a bunch of white tulips, the ones she always said reminded her of the flat we rented in our first year together, before either of us had a proper job or a proper bed frame. I left 2 hours later holding a photocopy of a legal notice with my own name typed on it as the respondent. That's not a metaphor. That's exactly what happened, and I'm going to tell you the whole thing, start to finish, because I think somewhere in the middle of this story you're going to recognize a warning sign or two, and maybe it'll save you from finding out the way I did. My name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just tell you what you need to know. I'm 38, I live just outside Manchester, and until that Tuesday morning in March, I believed I had a good marriage. Not a perfect one, nobody has a perfect one, but a good one. Solid. The kind where you don't lie awake wondering if the person next to you is already halfway out the door. I'd been married to Claire for 11 years. We met at university, we didn't have children, we had a mortgage on a 3-bedroom semi in Cheadle, 2 cars, a joint savings account we'd built up carefully since our late 20s, and, I thought, a shared plan for the rest of our lives. Claire worked for a mid-sized financial services firm in the city center, the kind of glass and steel building where every floor smells faintly of coffee and printer toner. She'd been climbing that ladder for years, and about 6 weeks before all this happened, she got the promotion she'd been chasing since I'd known her, head of regional client strategy, a proper title with a proper office and a proper pay rise. I was proud of her. Genuinely, unreservedly proud. So on that Tuesday, with nothing on my calendar and a florist 2 streets from my own office, I thought I'd surprise her. Flowers, a card, maybe lunch if she had the time. It felt like exactly the kind of thing a good husband does. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it matters later. I wasn't suspicious. I wasn't checking up on her. I had absolutely no reason to think anything was wrong. That's what makes what happened next hit as hard as it did. The lobby of her building was quiet, that particular hush you get in corporate spaces mid-morning, after the rush and before lunch. I signed in at reception, clipped on my visitor's badge, and took the lift to the 4th floor, tulips in hand, feeling, if I'm honest, a bit soft and sentimental about the whole thing. Her assistant told me Claire was in a meeting that would run another 20 minutes or so, and pointed me toward the staff break room to wait, since it had a decent view and a coffee machine that didn't taste like dishwater. I want to walk you through that room exactly as I remember it, because I've replayed it in my head more times than I can count. It was a good-sized space, glass on 2 sides, a long communal table, one of those big corkboards on the far wall covered in the usual office clutter, a rota for the kitchen cleaning duties, a flyer for a 5-a-side football team, a leaving card someone had pinned up for a colleague heading to Sydney. I put the flowers down on the table, poured myself a coffee I didn't really want, and let my eyes drift across the corkboard the way you do when you're killing time in an unfamiliar room. And that's when I saw it. Not tucked away. Not hidden in an envelope. Pinned, dead center, at eye level, above the leaving card and the football flyer, was an official-looking document. A legal letterhead. And my name, printed clearly enough to read from 6 feet away, under a single line that made my stomach drop through the floor, notice of intention to proceed with divorce. I want to be honest with you about what happened in my body in that moment, because I think it's important. I didn't shout. I didn't drop the coffee cup, dramatic as that would have been. I just went very, very still, the way you do right before your brain catches up with what your eyes have already told it. I stepped closer. I read it twice. My name. Our address. The date of our marriage. A formal statement, drafted by a solicitor's firm I'd never heard of, outlining her intention to file for divorce on grounds of irreconcilable differences, along with an attached proposal for the division of what it called matrimonial assets. Pinned to a corkboard. In a break room. Where anyone on that floor could read it. I didn't understand it then, not really, not the why of it, but I understood the fact of it. My marriage was over, and I was finding out about it from a piece of paper meant for an office audience, not for me. That's when the door opened behind me, and two of her colleagues walked in, chatting about a client call, and stopped dead when they saw my face. I didn't need to ask if they knew. Their expressions told me everything, that flicker of recognition, quickly smothered by pity, the kind of look you give someone who's just found out something the whole room already knew. One of them, a younger woman I vaguely recognized from a work Christmas party years back, actually reached out like she might touch my arm, then thought better of it and just said, quietly, "I think you should probably sit down." I didn't sit down. I stood there with a coffee going cold in my hand and 11 years of marriage rearranging itself in my head in real time, while two strangers who apparently knew more about my own divorce than I did stood awkwardly by the door, unsure whether to leave or stay. I'm not going to pretend I handled the next part with grace. I took the notice down off the corkboard, my name was on it, so I decided that gave me the right, folded it, and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I left the break room, left the building, and drove home without calling Claire, without texting her, without giving her the satisfaction of a reaction she could witness. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I said a single word to her about it. Because something about the whole scene didn't sit right with me. Why would a woman drafting divorce papers pin them, of all places, to a staff corkboard? That's not an accident. That's not carelessness. That felt deliberate. And once I let myself think that thought, a much colder one followed it. If the notice was deliberate, what else had been? That night, Claire came home late, which wasn't unusual given her new role, and found me sitting at the kitchen table with the folded notice in front of me and her laptop, the one she used for our joint accounts, open beside it. I'd spent the afternoon doing something I'd never done in 11 years of marriage, going through our finances line by line, transaction by transaction, like I was auditing a stranger's life. What I found didn't just confirm the marriage was ending. It told me it had been ending for a long time, quietly, on a schedule I had never been shown. Our joint high-yield savings account, the one we'd built up over 9 years, meant for a house extension we'd talked about for as long as I could remember, had once held just over £58,000. That evening, it held under £8,000. The withdrawals hadn't happened all at once. They'd happened in careful, staggered amounts over roughly 2 years, timed in a way that never once tripped whatever mental alarm I should have had but clearly didn't. 2,000 here for a work conference. 3,000 there for a course she needed for the promotion. A transfer to cover family stuff that I'd never questioned because I trusted her, and because that's what you do when you've built a life with someone, you don't treat every transaction like evidence. Except it turned out some of it was. Cross-referencing the dates against her calendar, which I could still see on our shared family account, I started to see the shape of something I didn't want to see. The withdrawals lined up almost exactly with milestones in her career, a certification course, a leadership program, a series of networking retreats that I now suspected had very little to do with networking. Her promotion hadn't come from nowhere. It had, in part, been funded by our savings, without my knowledge, while I'd been telling anyone who'd listen how proud I was of her for earning it on merit. I sat with that for a long time before she got home. And when she walked in and saw the look on my face, and then saw the notice on the table, she didn't apologize. She didn't even look surprised. She looked, more than anything, mildly inconvenienced that I'd found out this way rather than the way she'd apparently planned. "You weren't supposed to see that today," she said. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Let me explain." You weren't supposed to see that today. As if the problem was the timing, not the 11 years of marriage she'd apparently been quietly dismantling behind my back. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, why a legal notice with my name on it was pinned to a corkboard in her office break room. Her answer told me more than she probably intended it to. She said the firm's internal legal team had helped her draft it as part of what she called protecting her position ahead of the promotion being finalized, and that it had been left out by an assistant who was meant to file it, not display it. "A mistake," she said. "An admin error." I didn't believe her then, and I believe her even less now, because of what I found over the following days, once I stopped reacting and started actually looking. Claire had, it turned out, kept a folder, digital, password protected, but not quite well enough hidden from someone who'd shared a laptop and a life with her for over a decade, that she'd labeled, with what I can only describe as breathtaking coldness, transition plan. Inside it were spreadsheets tracking the drawdown of our joint savings against her projected new salary. There were drafts of the same divorce notice dated back nearly 18 months, each revision slightly more detailed than the last. There were notes, actual bullet-pointed notes, about optimal timing, references to waiting until her promotion was confirmed so that any settlement negotiations would happen from a position of financial strength, on her terms, with her earning power already established and mine, relatively speaking, diminished by comparison. She hadn't been drifting away from our marriage. She'd been executing an exit, methodically, for close to 2 years, while I brought her coffee in bed on Sunday mornings and told our friends how lucky I was. The breakroom notice wasn't a mistake. I'm as certain of that now as I've ever been certain of anything. It was a message, whether consciously intended that way or not, a way of making the end of our marriage public and irreversible on her terms, in her territory, surrounded by people who'd back her version of events before I'd even had the chance to hear it myself. She got to control the narrative from the very first moment. I was just supposed to walk in, see it, and quietly accept that the decision had already been made without me. I want to tell you that I confronted her that night with some devastating, quotable line, the kind of thing you'd see at the climax of a film. I didn't. I asked her one question. I asked her how much of our life together over the last 2 years had been real, and how much had been management. She didn't answer that one directly. She said something instead about needing to focus on her career, about feeling like I'd held her back for years without meaning to, about deserving a fresh start. Every sentence out of her mouth that night was about her deserving something. Not once did she say the words, "I'm sorry." I didn't shout. I didn't beg her to stay, and honestly, by that point, I didn't want her to. Something in me had already closed a door I hadn't realized was still open. What I did instead was quiet and, I think, far more effective than anger would have been. I picked up my phone, called a solicitor a colleague of mine had used a few years earlier for an unrelated matter, and asked for the earliest possible appointment. I wasn't going to let her control the pace of this the way she'd controlled everything else. The solicitor I met with 2 days later was blunt in a way I appreciated. She told me that under UK law, unauthorized or undisclosed depletion of joint matrimonial assets ahead of a divorce filing, what's sometimes referred to as dissipation of assets, can be taken into account by a court when dividing what's left. In plain terms, the fact that Claire had drained the bulk of our joint savings in the 2 years before filing, apparently to fund her own career advancement without my knowledge or agreement, wasn't just a betrayal. It was potentially a significant legal problem for her, and a significant advantage for me, if I could properly document it. Which, thanks to that folder she hadn't hidden quite as carefully as she thought, I could. Over the following weeks, working with my solicitor, we built a full financial picture, bank statements, the withdrawal timeline, her own spreadsheets from that transition plan folder, even email correspondence with her company's internal legal team about drafting the notice. It became very clear, very quickly, that this wasn't a straightforward divorce between two people who'd simply grown apart. This was, at minimum, a case of one party financially disadvantaging the other in a deliberate and sustained way ahead of a filing, and my solicitor was confident that a family court would see it exactly that way too. There's a scene I could describe here where I storm into her office, evidence in hand, and confront her in front of her board, the whole dramatic reckoning you might expect from a story like this. I won't pretend that didn't cross my mind. But that's not what happened, and honestly, I think what actually happened mattered more. Instead of a scene, I let the paperwork do the talking. My solicitor formally notified her solicitor of our intention to raise the asset dissipation as part of the settlement negotiations, along with the supporting documentation. No shouting. No public spectacle. Just facts, laid out clearly, in the exact kind of formal notice she'd been so comfortable using against me. The negotiations that followed were not the quiet, position of strength, settlement she'd apparently planned for. Because of the documented pattern of withdrawals and a clear paper trail showing they'd funded her professional advancement without my knowledge, the eventual settlement accounted for that imbalance directly. I won't go into exact figures, because that's between me, her, and two very expensive solicitors, but I'll say this much: the fresh start she'd been so determined to build on the back of our joint savings ended up costing her considerably more than she'd budgeted for, both financially and, I suspect, professionally, once it became clear within her own firm exactly how that promotion had been quietly financed. The divorce was finalized a little over 8 months after that Tuesday morning with the tulips. I still have them, by the way, not the actual flowers, obviously. Those went in the bin days after I stopped noticing they were there, wilting on the kitchen counter while my whole life rearranged itself around them. But I kept the receipt from the florist, tucked into a drawer, for reasons I still can't fully explain to myself. Maybe as a reminder of the exact moment I stopped being naive about people, or maybe just as a strange little marker of the last day I believed my marriage was something other than what it actually was. I think about that breakroom a lot, if I'm honest. Not with bitterness anymore, that faded faster than I expected it to, once the practical matters were sorted and I had space to actually feel what had happened rather than just manage it. What stays with me is the calculation of it. The 2 years of quiet planning. The careful, staggered withdrawals designed never to raise a flag. The folder with the spreadsheets. The willingness to use her own workplace, her own colleagues, as an audience for the end of our marriage, so that by the time I found out, the story had already been told without me in the room. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've turned that question over more times than I can count, I think it's this. Trust in a marriage isn't a passive thing. It's not something you just have and then stop paying attention to. I trusted Claire completely, and for years that trust was warranted. But somewhere along the way, quietly, without a single dramatic argument or obvious red flag, that trust stopped being checked against reality, and by the time reality showed up, pinned to a corkboard, of all places, the gap between what I believed and what was actually true had grown wider than I could have imagined. Pay attention to the quiet inconsistencies. A withdrawal here, an unexplained expense there, a partner who seems increasingly focused on their own trajectory in ways that don't quite include you anymore. None of those things alone means betrayal. But patterns matter. Timing matters. And if you ever find yourself in a position where you need to understand exactly what's happened to shared finances, in the UK at least, there are real legal protections around the dissipation of matrimonial assets, protections I wish I'd known about far earlier than I did, and protections that, in the end, made sure I didn't walk away from 11 years of marriage with absolutely nothing to show for it beyond a folded piece of paper from a breakroom corkboard. I left that building with flowers I never got to give her and a legal notice I never asked for. But I didn't leave empty-handed in the way she'd planned for me to. And honestly, looking back now, from the other side of all of it, I think that's the part of this story that matters most. If this story hit home for you, or if you've ever had to piece together the truth of a relationship the hard way, I'd genuinely like to hear about it. Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because there's plenty more where this came from. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.